Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
A very warm welcome. You're watching Your Take, and I'm your host, James Ewen. Please subscribe to our channel for all our interviews with people about their lives, careers, and their path along the way. On today's Your Take, I'm joined by an accomplished musician who has a passion for all forms of music. My guest is a classically trained guitarist who's experimented with other styles and techniques. My guest is a doctor of musical arts, an award-winning teacher, and a producer. His producing credits include Brooklyn Night, A Waltz Before I Go, and Wonder Wheel, the singer-songwriter Lisa Brigantino, Yesterday Dream by Michael Scott Ferris, and most recently, early live recordings of sisters Terre and Maggie Roche on the album Can You See That Sun? My guest performs regularly on the live New York circuit. He's lectured on various aspects of the electric guitar, has taught guitar and music continuously for over 25 years, and has recently released a solo album entitled Suite 1 for electric guitar. Today I'm joined by Thomas Millioto. We talk about living and working in New York, his discovery of music and the sixth string, what made him embark on a teaching career, and his work as a musician and producer. A very warm welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you kindly for joining me on Your Take and sharing your story and, more importantly, your journey through music from the humble beginnings to present day. And obviously we'll talk about your musical career and life in some depth. Do you mind if we start by rewinding the clock and going back to the very beginnings, Thomas? Good to go back to your early life. You've been a New York resident all your life. Can you share with us where you were born and which part of New York you grew up in?
Sure. I was born in Buffalo, New York, right downtown Buffalo. And I spent the first 9 years of my life there. And at that point, our family moved to a suburb called West Seneca, where I spent my tween and teen years before going to college at Fredonia State, which is even further west in New York. So Buffalo is western New York. Fredonia is so far west that if you went any further, you'd be in Pennsylvania. Or you'd be in another state. So,
yeah, I want to pick up shortly on your academia, because you mentioned about college, your college years. Before we do so, I wanted to try and tap into music and where this passion comes from. Did you come from a musical family, and what music was being played around the home growing up, and what music did you discover yourself, and were there particular styles or artists that particularly inspired you to want to play guitar?
well, I wouldn't say that I come from a musical family. My mom played a bit of the piano. My dad liked music, and we had, as was called at the time, the hi-fi around the house. And so I'd be hearing things that in retrospect I thought, well, it's a good thing I heard those being very young, and not knowing the difference. Things like Sinatra albums. And, but also things like Italian folk song and maybe some opera arias. My mother liked Johnny Mathis and Nat King Cole. And so there was this kind of Pan-American exposition, in my ears. I don't think, I would have been more likely to hear Montevani than Monteverdi, if you know what I mean. And so I didn't really grow up with classical music as my baseline of what I heard. Jazz, not really. Rock was just evolving, really. So I'd be hearing AM radio and, looking back, hearing AM radio in a car that only had AM radio and remembering to hear a Beatles song and thinking, oh, I like that song. It's kind of remarkable how culturally significant those little songs became. But really, I can't say that I came from a musical family and so I moved forward through those well-trodden paths. I was actually interested in magic when I was a kid. And one of my boyhood idols was Houdini, And I think when the novelty of that wore off, the sort of mystical allure of music set in, which is it's kind of another way of doing the same thing, where there's something going on and you can't quite grasp how. Like Frankenstein in the movie, when he's meeting up with the blind man, he plays the fiddle, he's going, trying to grab the sound. What is that? It's some magical thing that's happening. And at that time, when I was in grade school, experimented with different things. The first instrument that I ever played, my mom sat down with my brother and I one day and said, well, your dad and I want to give you both music lessons. What instrument would you like to play? So, of course, I said drums. And my mom said, no, your dad works the night shift. You're not playing drums. So, of course, I said banjo, which is very strange. And so they got me a banjo and got me some lessons, but they didn't think, and of course neither did I, that I was so small that I couldn't even reach the frets for the banjo. So that didn't last long. But I still have that banjo, and Lisa now plays it. So that was no love lost there. But I always played around on my mother's keyboard, and she got me a little play-by-number organ, which was a fad at the time. And then fast forward to a few grades, I took some trumpet lessons. And I liked that, but I gave it up. And in retrospect, I think it's because I had undiagnosed asthma. And of all the brass instruments, trumpet is the most demanding. I would think it would be tuba or something huge, but it's actually the smaller ones that need more lung strength, and I just didn't have it. So I was kind of floundering, and I played bass guitar and took lessons on bass guitar for a little while. So at this point, I had some musical background, some intuitive, some taught, reading treble clef, reading bass clef, right? But my brother played a little guitar in the church folk group, and he had a kind of knockaround electric. And I started picking those up, having gotten the facility from the bass. And the bug hit hard. The bug bit, totally. And there was just no turning back. It was obvious. The bug bit. And in short order, well, in turn, I did receive a guitar from my parents. They bought me a guitar, a nice one. And the fact that it was so good, I think, just changed everything for me, because it made it possible for me to learn on my own. And I kind of played with some classmates in a little garage/basement band when I was in 7th and 8th grade. But when I went to high school for 9th grade, there were some people there who kept saying, well, you should come and play with our band. I was just like, no, I have some guys I play with. No, you should come play with our band. And they eventually got me to come down, and I played with them, and it was like, oh, I see. They're a little better than the other guys I played with. I think I can learn more here, And so I started playing with them, and that group, which was called Decade, had lots of different machinations. At first, there was a bunch of people in it, all different grades. And by the second year, by the time I was a sophomore, most of them had graduated. So I was lucky to play with older people and get that experience. Because all this while, I didn't have a teacher. So I was learning things by trying to pick them up from the records, developing my ear, watching other people. But they wanted me in the group because they wanted to learn how to play guitar from me. They wanted me in the group to pick my brain. So that went pretty well. And when I was a sophomore, our band played a regional battle of the bands sponsored by a radio station called WZIR, The Wizard, right? And the prize was that, and this was many bands, maybe 20 bands. It went all day. It was at a place called Uncle Sam's, which was an old warehouse. It was converted to a disco. And it just took all day. And most of the band, a good number of the bands I gather were disqualified because they were too old. These were supposed to be like kids. And so you had all these like 20-something-year-old guys in the band, and they're like, no, well, you can play, but you're not going to win. And so this went on all day, and then in the end, they said we won. And I was shocked. It was like, wow, that's amazing. That's, and the prize was that you got recording time in a studio, a professional studio, which at the time was a big deal. It's not like today everybody's got a studio on their laptop. And you got a spot on the album that the radio station released every year of local talent, which was kind of like a break, you know what I mean? It's not a career, but it was sort of like, oh, that's a break. But then in very short order, the radio station went out of business and we got nothing. So
I want to tap into this obsession with the six string and
yeah,
and talk about this in some detail. What was it about the six string that you found so fascinating and you wanted to give up so much of your time to learning this instrument and becoming a very competent musician? What was it? Why do you think it was particularly the love of guitar that you wanted to pursue above the other instruments that you experimented with originally at a young age? Why specifically guitar?
That's a really good question. I think it has to do with the fact that a guitar could be anything in terms of its function. In other words, you could play a solo on a guitar. You could play an accompaniment on a guitar. You could put a guitar in the case and take it with you and bring it somewhere and not have to move a piano, which might be the only other way you could have an accompaniment instrument. You see what I mean? You could do pretty much anything. If you wanted a solo, you could do that. You could figure that out. You could go down that road. If you wanted to accompany, you could figure out how to do that better. If you wanted to be mobile, you could do that as well. I didn't feel like I had that functionality on the bass guitar. I didn't feel like I had that functionality on the trumpet. I didn't feel like I could write songs on the trumpet. Miles Davis could, but I'm not Miles Davis. Right? So that I think is maybe why the guitar then, as opposed to other things. Also the guitar, the electric guitar, has a particular kind of sound, which is I have a student, or I've had a student. I taught him since he was 9. He's now in his 20s, so I see him occasionally, but he's moved on to other things. And we were once talking about tone. And he was saying how great the tone is on an electric guitar. And I said, well, the classical guitar has a really nice tone too. And very quickly, without thinking, he said, yeah, but it doesn't change your life. And I was like, touche, Rusty. You're actually kind of right about that. And I think there's reasons for that. And I think the other thing that is part of your question that might not have been asked is, well, why did the bug bite at all? Why, when you got to the guitar and you had that functionality, did suddenly it take over, right? And I think it's because, and this has a lot to do with my philosophy and methods of teaching too. When you work on music that way, it's not that you're working on the music, you're working on yourself. You're working on your own development. That's hard to not to be enthusiastic about, especially as a teenager. That's your job.
Early in our conversation, I discovered that you didn't necessarily come from a musical family, but you were exposed to music via the hi-fi system and, of course, through AM radio and all the influences and the discovery of instruments. But when did the realization sink in, and at what kind of period or age did you think, actually, it's my intention to, fulfill a career or progress or work to a career as a musician? And what also, Thomas, made you decide to continue your academia and study music? And can you tell us where you studied and what did you learn from your time there?
Okay, that was a lot of questions. The first one was how.
Yeah, when did the sort of realization sink
Okay,
in?
that realization, and how did it see through? Well, let's put it this way. I think that the way I learn isn't necessarily well in line with the way school was taught when I went through it. And I'm talking about grade school and high school. And so, I didn't dislike school or anything like that. I just didn't love it. And, when I graduated from high school, they gave me a watch because I never missed a day. Of course, there were snow days because it was around Buffalo, right? But, and high school was better for me than grade school, which was very regimented. But it was really when I went to college that, the typical thing is people say, well, you better do good in high school and, in grade school and high school, and because college, it's much different. It's much tougher. You're on your own. And that's true. But I couldn't learn unless I was, and I think, in this context, I could say clearly with a little background that when the bug hit and I found that other people were going out of their way to drag me in their band, and we were, by the time I was in high school, 2 years, a radio station, it went out of business, but recognized us as the best band in that whole area, right? I began thinking, well, maybe I have something to offer here. maybe there's something in there. And I certainly like to do this. And also, at that time, I didn't know how many things people did to make music. The only thing I knew is that there were people who played in bands. I didn't know that there were organists who played for the church and choir directors, and I wasn't thinking about music professors or musicologists. Or, I didn't know those people existed, those job descriptions. I just knew music. And the other thing I was really interested in was recording. And it was very different than it is now. You couldn't just record on a laptop. There was no such functionality. And so when it came time to figure out, where I might be wanting to go to college and whatnot, there was really only one clear choice, because I really, 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 really wanted to study sound recording. And there were only a couple places to study it. And the best one was a state school, which was about my only choice financially. And it was Fredonia, which was only an hour away, and which my grandparents on my mother's side grew up in Fredonia. So there was this kind of family tie. And so I only applied to one college because I wanted to go there. And at first I did not get in the recording department, but by the second semester I was at least in the music department, and I started double majoring in performance and philosophy. And in my junior year, I was admitted to the sound recording department. I dropped my major of philosophy to a minor, and it was done. And then I took all the sound recording classes. So at that time, what I was thinking is that I wanted to be a producer. That was the best way to roll all of this together. And the ultimate expression of that would be to one day work in the A&R department of a record company, where you'd be kind of nurturing talent and produce records. And many of the people who did that, about half of the people who did that, worked on the engineering side. And about half of the people that did that worked originally as musicians. And I thought, well, if I could double major in both, I'll have a better chance of getting into that area. And also, the more I learn about myself and the more I learn about how my personality works and how I naturally interface with other people, I think that was a wise decision, maybe beyond my years, in terms of self-knowledge. I am naturally someone who likes to help other people and help them develop. And unless you have a kind of natural ability to do that, it's hard to live a life like that that's efficient enough and where you're faking it. You have to really want other people to shine in order to get them to shine. And it worked. Even some of the things I did as a student there as recording projects really kind of stuck out in a way. And I remember one particular time where it was getting close to graduation. I was a recording major. I needed a project to record. I had to go find something, someone, some band, some entity to record. And someone came to the music department saying, well, we are this organization, and we have this song, and we want this song to be recorded, and we want this song to be kind of our theme song for our organization. Do you have any majors who would like to take this on? And of course, everybody's interested in their band or their buddy's band or what's cool. And I thought, when I get out of here, I'm going to be lucky to work in all, and I am not going to like everyone I work with. I better figure this out now. Plus, these are real people in the real world. They might have connections. They might need me for something else. Maybe I should talk to these people. And so I did. And it turned out that they were kind of very 80s kind of just say no, anti-drug sort of thing. And I thought, oh, okay, there's always a caveat. And not that drugs are a good thing, but neither is being particularly overzealous about anything in particular, in my opinion. So, but I thought, again, I don't always get to work with people I'm crazy about. And this is an opportunity for me. So I said yes. And I had to work with their singers, and I had to work with the musicians. I had to find people to come in, and I had to really kind of act like a Phil Spector. And this was the age of We Are the World, where these sorts of songs have these sort of choral endings. And I wrote an arrangement and brought the gospel choir in at the school. And unfortunately, they were not able to sing it to their liking, much less mine. So then I had to scratch all of that, very real world, and cash in some political capital and ask some acquaintances who were in the select chamber choir to come in and sight read this, which they did a beautiful job. And when that was done, I never heard anything again. It just kind of evaporated, disappeared. But years, decades later, I heard through a friend, from a friend, or through another friend, that someone who was also a student of mine, someone who was also a student there, that was a classmate of mine, and went on to have quite an elaborate career in recording, said that recording that I did was one of the most professional thing that came out of that studio to that date. And I thought that was particularly generous of that person to say, because by doing that, I made enemies everywhere, right? Everywhere. But it wasn't like I was trying to sell a philosophy. I was trying to help people do what they needed to do in a musical way, and I was good at it. So I think, why did I decide to go into it? There's a lot tied in there, music and how I work with people, and it just seemed, when you know all the facts, it's kind of a no-brainer.
During your time at music college, you go on to meet your future wife, Lisa Brigantino, who, like yourself, had a career as a professional musician. Can you recall first meeting Lisa and your time spent together at music college? And why do you think you had a special connection on both a personal and professional level?
Well, when I first met Lisa, obviously I didn't know her. We had no mutual friends at that time or anything. She was just that cute girl with the guitar I'd see her on campus, And I eventually found a way to introduce myself, and found out what she was all about, and began to realize that she was somewhat of already a kind of underground cult figure at Fredonia. There were people who would show up to open mics, and they were folk singers, and there was a whole scene of that. But when she walked into a room in that context, people were kind of, Lisa's here, or when they talked about someone writing their own songs, they, speak of Lisa in kind of hushed tones, because she's amazing. She is just so amazing. And so, it's not like we met and started dating and I've known her ever since. We dated for a little while, but some of the time that I was interacting with her was just purely. I remember once, because the sound recording majors, so-called tonemeisters, the older ones were paired with the ones who hadn't been in the program as long, right? So so I was an assistant to an older engineer who was doing Lisa as a recording, and she ended up using my guitar, which I still have, and I just remember going through that whole process and being very impressed with how apt she was in every way. And so I think the ability to relate to her as a musician, as a producer, as a collaborator, is there entirely separately from the fact that we've been married for nearly a quarter century. Yeah, so it was really after we left college that we eventually got back together and got married. But I think there was always that thread of mutual respect and for each other's skill sets.
Let's talk about that mutual respect and, of course, musical collaboration, because you've worked closely with your wife as a guitarist and have engineered and co-produced all her albums, which include A Brooklyn Night, Wonder Wheel, and Our Waltz Before I Go. What attracted you to music producing, and of the recordings you've done with Lisa and other musicians, which ones would you cite as your favorites and why?
Well, the first part of your question, what attracted me to producing in general? I mean, everything I just was sort of discussing about Fredonia, and I think it just felt like a very natural thing. I don't, and also, producer is such a vague term. I use it. Some people use it like a badge, but I use it because it's vague enough to apply. Because it could mean pretty much anything. But I also think that what are the favorite ones? That's like asking how many clowns can fit in a Volkswagen. One more, and the favorite is really going to be the next. Because you're always trying to move ahead. And so if I had to say, what's the second favorite, it's the last one, because we've been moving along in that direction. So the I'll Waltz Before I Go, when we trace the trajectory of Lisa's releases, we're also tracing the trajectory of the state of the technology and the state of our studio. So through time, we have different software, different microphones, different things come up that allow us to do better things. Of course, my skill sets pick up as well. So, and sometimes I'm reluctant to go back and say, listen to A Brooklyn Night, which we did on an off-the-shelf beige Mac with the RCA connectors in the back. We didn't even have a proper A to D converter. And one microphone, which was a glorified SM57, which is, and one mic preamp. So we had almost nothing by today's standards. And I always kind of cringe when I go back to listen to that, and then I think, no, actually, it's okay. Some of the choices I might have made differently, but we had it mastered by Andy Van Dad at Masterdisc, and that, along with what we were able to do at the time, holds up pretty well. And I'd like to, think that, of course, then Wonder Wheel went much, much, much further because it had been a long time. And then I was wondering, are we really going to be able to surpass this? But by the time the A Waltz Before I Go came out, it was clear that we could. And I know our next one will even be a notch up from that. So I'm looking forward to that. But as far as my own things, I'm working on a recording of 19th century guitar things. So when that comes out, that will be my favorite of that type. And the EP that I put out of my suite for electric guitar is my favorite of that type because it's the last and the first. And I'm sure, I already know what I would do differently, and I've already made some changes to that effect. And I would actually like to re-record that suite as I make a recording of, say, another suite or other music that I write in a similar vein, and have not so much an EP but an LP as a release for the next one for myself. All of these projects have kind of taken a back seat lately to another thing that I'm working on, which really has more to do with modernizing my teaching. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Yeah, we'll come on to the teaching aspect shortly. Before we do so, I wanted to go from producing and come back now to the guitar. And we've obviously spoke about the love and obsession for playing and the guitar as an instrument, but we now come on to the classical guitar. And what was it about that particular style? And can you discuss learning and the techniques that were required to master the sound and procedure of actually executing that particular style of music?
Well, yes, I can give an overview. I mean, an in-depth one could take years, but there's so much involved. Suffice it to say that when I was in my high school bands, I listened to a lot of rock music because that's what we were playing. And my senior year of high school, everybody from my band graduated except for me, and I actually got in a band with rival high school players, and we did all prog rock. Half our show was old Genesis and things like that. So by the time I got to college, I kind of needed something else. I had my fill. It's almost as though, Black Sabbath wasn't heavy enough for me anymore. And I turned to Beethoven, or that prog rock wasn't complex enough, so I turned to Bach. And that paradigm shift, or that growth really, was occurring at the same time I was trying to get into the sound recording department. And the sound recording department, it was very difficult to get into, still is to this day. You had to play an instrument. And to this day, they do not consider electric guitar an instrument. You could be Pat Metheny, you could be Wes Montgomery reincarnate, and they would tell you you don't play an instrument, so you can't be in the department. You have to play classical guitar. So I set out to learn classical guitar. And what I found was that, okay, yes, there is a difference in the technique, and I had a learning curve. But I also learned that I was much more careful about developing my technique habits than most of the people who were playing rock guitar around me. And that curve was smaller than maybe it should have been, because I was very aggressive about trying to stave off future problems by being ruthless about my technique to the extent that I could figure out what that should be. And it really did me a lot of good. Of course, I still had to change things. You can't teach yourself everything like that. It takes years and generations for that kind of information to come down. But just by being careful, I really was allowed myself to make rapid progress on the classical guitar. And so, yeah, I got into it because they told me I had to, in a sense. But I was headed there anyway. It was inevitable. I was going to be playing classical guitar. And when I started getting into playing classical guitar, I realized that I was finally playing really autonomous full pieces on the guitar, and that its full promise was realized. I was not just accompanying someone or just playing lead. I was playing the melody and the accompaniment all the time. And my primary job then was conductor or mixer, producer, on the spot, So that felt like a comfort zone where I'm worried about not just, am I playing the right note here in this lead, or am I playing the right chord here in this, but what's the balance between the foreground and the background? How's the tempo moving? What's my tone like? All of that. The things that a producer or a conductor would be worrying about. That felt right. And so, even though I dropped my minor in philosophy, I dropped my major in philosophy to a minor and it was done my junior year, I double majored in performance and sound recording, even though, I did finally get into sound recording. I didn't want to give that up. A lot of people in sound recording honestly did major in other things because you were required to take more credits in that than any other major in the entire SUNY system. So, and you were required to take a lot of things that didn't give you any credit, like sit desk all night for someone else, assist someone else, be in the orchestra, or in my case, the choir, because the orchestra didn't have a guitar spot, and be on ensembles. So beyond that, then we have more credits to take than any other major in the entire SUNY system. So a lot of people didn't have to take that many more credits to get a double major in physics, electronics, applied music, in my case, music performance, which is more credits than just applied, and a host of other things. So I wasn't unusual in the sense that I double majored, but had I not done that, it wouldn't have then later come back to me to have a degree in guitar with a double major in sound recording that I could then take and get a master's and then eventually a doctorate in.
I want to talk about another chapter in your career, and that's teaching, which you've been committed to for many, many years and is an important aspect of your life that I want to come on to now. Mm-hmm. You've been a guitar teacher for many years. What made you decide to pursue a career as a teacher? And can you discuss where you've taught music, what areas you specialize in, and where do you teach now, and how can people find out how they can study with you?
The answer to the last one is easy. Just go to my website, thomasmillioto.com, and you can get contact information there. To take a larger view, when I graduated from Fredonia. I spent a little over a year in Rochester, New York, and I worked in the Eastman School of Music in the recording department in various capacities. I was an intern for a little while in the recording department. I also worked on a grant phase preserving old recordings. While I did that, I was also studio manager / engineer / coffee maker at a local recording studio called Dynamic Recording. But when the grant phase ran up, I decided that I wanted to move to New York and sort of be where more activity was. And I didn't have coattails to rest on. My family's not from New York City. I don't, I had to get going, hit the ground running, making money, getting an apartment, and doing all of that. So being an intern in a recording studio for no money for a year to pay my dues just simply wasn't an option. And it's also in this era where digital is really coming along and all the studios are going out of business and those jobs just kind of disappeared anyway. And in that environment, I wasn't really sure how to accomplish this goal of moving to New York. And it was my philosophy professor I spoke to who said, well, you should be a paralegal. And I had never heard of one. And he said, yeah, they're like assistants to lawyers. My philosophy professor, Dr. Belliati, used to be an attorney. And so he was saying, oh, yeah, you could do that. No problem. And at the time, the field of paralegaling was different. And so I moved to New York and I tried to get a job as a paralegal, and I ended up at the second largest firm in Manhattan in the litigation department. And so that was a day and night and day job. I mean, if I left at 11 p.m. at night, I'd get dirty looks about, oh, so you're leaving early. I mean, it was a grinder. And my first check, I think, had 100 hours of overtime. And that was just the lifestyle. So there really wasn't time or energy. And I needed to test myself. I needed to say, hey, if I do something like this and I do well and I have, human connections here and I have a whole different thing and there's a retirement account that, is happening and all this stuff. Am I going to be happy with that? How does that go? And for me, the answer was absolutely no. No, it did not work out. Maybe if I went into paralegaling at a different time in the trajectory, the history, but in 1990, it was a particularly notoriously bad time to do that. And it was a particularly notoriously difficult firm that I worked for. High pressure. And I did that for 5 years, almost to the day, and went back to school. And my thinking at that time, to answer your question, was, yes, it's worth it. I need to be doing music. I'm not happy when I'm not. I have something to offer there. Nobody's getting it. And I'm miserable here. I can't really have a trajectory here where my mental health will be preserved if I keep doing this. I can't do it. And so I went back to, and what I really wanted to do is go back part-time, but you can't do that for a master's in music. You just can't do it. I was disappointed in that at the time. I thought it was a policy issue, but it's really different than that. If you're not doing all of those things simultaneously, they don't get cross-referenced into an understanding. You'll never get it. You can't do it in a serial way. You have to cut a chunk out of your life, do all of that at once, let it all marinate together, and then that's the thing that earns you the master's. So I did that with the intention at that point to teach. And ultimately, the credential to teach at the college level, which was what I was looking to do, was to have a doctorate. So, yeah, I went through at Stony Brook University and did the master's and doctorate there. And the doctorate was really about period performance, older music. Um, my final recital, which was essentially my thesis, consisted of equal parts Baroque lute, 19th century guitar, which is a little different. It's kind of like this style of guitar, and one-third modern guitar. And at the time, I believe that was unprecedented. No one had ever done anything that audacious. So, did that answer your question fully? Kind of take you through the where and the why?
Yeah, it did. I want to move back to producing and creating and talk about some of the projects you worked on, which you kind of picked up on earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You recently released a solo album
Mm-hmm.
inspired by your love of the electric guitar called Suite One for electric guitar. Can you give us a flavor of the instrumental tracks on the album and how it's been received? And can you also share with us some of your favorite musical pioneers famous for playing the electric guitar?
Well, sure. Well, Suite One is kind of a culmination of many years of sort of incubation of these different influences. Um, so if we go back to my garage band days, or basement band, whatever it was, I really loved the sound of the electric guitar. It's a great sound, and there are reasons for that. There's physics involved. There are just simply more overtones on those notes if you have your amp set a particular way than you could get out of any acoustic instrument. So there is a sense of a sound being enhanced. And I think that's what my student was referring to when he said something like, yeah, but it doesn't change your life. Yeah. Well, this is really a kind of super duper sound. It's supernatural because it doesn't exist in nature, really. It has to be created artificially. You couldn't, no matter how many turtle shells and pieces of gut you get, you'll never get a note that sounds like Black Sabbath because it's just not physically possible. And that's one of the things I talk about in my Jimi Hendrix lecture, which is, he's a big influence. He was the one in my mind and in the mind of many others who basically created the template for rock guitar. And what I like to say is a kind of catch-all from the lectures, one of the many, is that if you think of it this way, it makes more sense, is that Hendrix didn't really play the guitar as much as he played the amp with the guitar. He played the amplification process. He was really pretty much a recording engineer with a guitar. And he was also in the moment pushing the development of all of these things and making it sort of providing a financial incentive for these sorts of sound modification devices and amplifiers to have the kind of arms race they had, which created the sounds even long after he was gone. So to that part of your question, Hendrix was a big influence. But I think there comes a point where there are people who just kind of play Bach really fast on the internet and things like that, and that's fine if you're really into that. What I was really looking for was a way of making repertoire and not sort of clickbait. And one of the main problems here is when you start having an instrument which produces more overtones than can be produced in nature. The music theory that underlies all of that music warps with it. And so it's not that it doesn't apply anymore. It's as though you took the contents of a music theory book and dragged it over near a black hole. And you have to say, well, what bends? How far? In what direction? What am I going to do about it? That's the starting point to write that suite. And that's why it took me about 4 years to solve that problem. And, if you were to listen to it, it kind of just sounds like it goes by and, oh yeah, okay, that's how it sounds. But if you played that on an acoustic instrument like a piano, well, first of all, in parts of it, your fingers would get all tied up in knots and you couldn't do it. And then there are other parts that would just fall flat and sound odd. And you would wonder why. And you might think, well, Tom, you made a mistake here in the composition. But it's really bending what I'm writing as a function of the sound of the amp and accommodating that. And what I like about it is that having solved that problem, or at least having a window into possible solutions, I can now have that sound or that field of sounds, from the beautiful, sparkly clean to the aggressively mid-heavy, crunchy things, and everything in between. And I don't have to play songs. I mean, songs are nice, but I wanted to play what felt like repertoire, classical music, a prelude, an allemande, a gigue. And classical guitarists are notorious for always kind of going around and begging for repertoire from other instruments, And then when you get it, oh, it's good music, but then it doesn't fit. You run out of fingers. You have to change the key. You have to change the tuning. Now you can't quite get that. Well, you can't do that part, so you have to write it out. And there's always compromise. And, when I started thinking of doing classical music on the electric guitar, I would try and transcribe. And, once in a while it would work out. And I would play, say, the allemande from Bach's B minor partita. That happened to work out. But you can't get giant chunks of repertoire and just bring them over and expect them to work. And so I finally realized I'm going to have to take responsibility for learning to write. I just have to do that. I have to learn to write, be a composer, and then I can have music that really works on the electric guitar. And then once I started doing that, I began figuring out why no one did it. And it's because it doesn't play well with others. When you have that big sound, you have to completely rethink the theory under the music. So that's what brought me down that rabbit hole. And emerging from that, victorious, now when I get to play that sort of music on an electric guitar, I get to play classical music. I get to essentially do it on my own terms. I get to basically use each piece as a thesis for why this is a good idea. In some small way, that suite represents a kind of micro, mini, well-tempered clavier where it's designed to solve a problem and show you why it's a valuable problem to solve, all without speaking a word. And so, plus, then you get that life-changing sound that my student likes so much, and I get to play that. So it's as though I can finally mix classical music and the sound I love all in the same ice cream sundae and have it all at once. So what's not to love about that?
Thomas, now let's talk about live music. How often do you perform live on the musical circuit? And of all the guitar styles you've played and performed, do you have a favorite? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, I think if I have a favorite right now, it is probably that electric classical sort of thing, and for all the reasons I just outlined, it gives me all of what I want together. If I had to pick a second favorite, or at least maybe an equal favorite, it would be the 19th century classical guitar. The polyphony, or the ability to play more than one line at a time, is greatly enhanced when you don't have to use a pick. And when you have strings that aren't tiny little, almost barbed wire things, but are more like a piece of gut or a nylon string. You can get your fingers in there better. And so, like the Bach violin partitas, a lot, and cello suites, a lot of what I'm doing on the electric guitar is applied harmony, or implied harmony, implied counterpoint. What I can do on a classical guitar is explicitly counterpoint and harmony. And what I like about the 19th century guitar is that it fits me better. It literally fits me better. It's a little smaller. I'm a little smaller. But also the repertoire, the aesthetic, the lyricism, the sense of rubato, the whole era works well with my musical sensibility, as does the instrument, both physically and aesthetically. So that's a real comfort zone for me as well. And so, I really like that. And so in terms of performing live, I've played some performances on that 19th century classical guitar. There's a place in Manhattan that usually has opera in it, where occasionally they'll have chamber music. I was invited twice to play there. And that's a beautiful concert hall. But I've also played at, say, the Italian consulate. And I've been invited to do things where the music of especially Mario Giuliani is appreciated, and I play a lot of his music. But as far as the electric, I played my suite and some other similar material, a set of Folia variations that I wrote, and the Bach Allemande I mentioned at the Bitter End, which is an iconic sort of club in New York where everybody has played, from Bob Dylan to Joni Mitchell to even Miles Davis and Les Paul, who's another one of my sort of guitar hero people to look up to. And so that was interesting, even though it's not a classical venue. I've also played at a place called Spectrum. Now, they keep moving around, but that's really more of a place where more cutting-edge avant-garde classical music is heard. Played there a few times. But I've also played at the Bitter End with alumni from my wife's band. So we did a Zeppelin show there. And I'm actually going to be playing at the Bitter End at the end of next month as part of an evening of music by a company called Music Makers, where I'm a music director, or that's my title anyway. People sign up for these workshops and have a couple rehearsals, and then Music Makers has a whole night at a club where every half hour there's a different workshop. And I'm involved with being music director for two of them right now. One is called Gods of Thunder. So it's all early hard rock, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Mountain, things like that. But the other one is all Bowie. And so we'll be, two of the sets during that night. And so I'll have a part to play in that. I wouldn't exactly call that one of my gigs, but it's, being out there on the scene and doing that. I've also played here and there at the Cutting Room, in various capacities with my wife as part of her release show, but also often at private parties, things like that. And of course, there's a Sunset Singing Circle. It's not really a performance, but Terry kind of welcomes Lisa and I, along with a few other people who have been coming regularly for many, many years, to help her provide a backdrop of music for people to sing along at the Sunset Singing Circle. So, those are those sorts of things. It's not like I'm in a band and we play around at the clubs. I've never done that in New York City, and by the time I moved here, that scene was kind of dead. And now, where CBGB's was, it's nothing, and the Continental's gone, and like that whole scene just evaporated.
Thomas, we nearly come to that moment where we ask all your Take guests the same questions to finish up the interview and discover maybe things we don't know about them and we've not established during the course of the discussion. But before we do so, one final question. Are there any creative areas of music or outside that you'd like to explore? And what are your other areas of interest away from music? And are you currently involved in any projects?
Well, actually, I am kind of tangentially involved right now very deeply in a project that involves incorporating a lot of skill sets that I either don't have or I'm enhancing. Things like copywriting and marketing and web design and other kinds of design, because I'm engaged in creating an app, something you could run on your phone or tablet, that would have my core teachings in it. And it seems like every guitar teacher has one of these, but I'm trying to encapsulate better part of 30 years of teaching and maybe 40 years of playing into something that would run on your phone. And so it's a little difficult to get that much down into a form that would be in your phone. So, and also the proper way to frame it in terms of marketing and things like that. Right now, I am deeply involved with those skill sets and getting that together. And if anyone wants to know more about that, they can go to, they can see one of my Facebook pages, Thomas Millioto DMA. That's my professional page. Or go to my website, thomasmillioto.com. I haven't announced anything about it yet. This is the first I'm talking about it, but there should be a beta's version soon. And so, yeah, that's something I'm working on. And in terms of other things, if there's other areas that I would like to explore creatively, not saying that marketing and whatnot can't be creative, it certainly can, but things that I'm more naturally drawn to are things like painting and anything involving storytelling, because I think classical musicians really are storytellers, even if it is opaque, which could include things like any form of writing, film. I was surprised when I went back to I still have a high school yearbook, and occasionally I'll look at it when someone comes out of the blue in Facebook. I was like, who is that person again? I'm glad I kept that, And then I'll see what people wrote in it, and I was shocked to remember that so many people remembered me from high school as a writer of words, not music. Just didn't remember that. So I think there may be a skill set in there that can also come out. So yeah, anything in film, storytelling of any sort. Yeah, does that answer your question well enough?
It does indeed. And Thomas Millioto, we've come to that moment. As I mentioned earlier, we ask all your take guests these quick fire questions to end the interview and discover things maybe we didn't establish or know about them. Are you ready for this? You don't need to think about these in any detail.
Okay.
Here we go. Number one, Thomas. What would you say is your favorite pastime?
Taking a walk in Prospect Park, because that's something I would do just to pass the time. You know, there are other things I do, and they pass the time beautifully. But then I have other. I have ulterior motives for doing them. You're moving ahead to be, as a musician or whatnot. But just taking a walk in Prospect Park, that's something that Beethoven was famous for, taking walks in nature and whatnot, and I could see why. I actually think it's because nature is so much more complex than anything we come up with, that it helps to connect with a kind of organic complexity.
A musician, a producer, of course, a teacher, and you've lectured in music as well. But if you could have had a different profession, Thomas, outside of music, what would it have been?
Well, I had even considered going to law school when I was a philosophy major. And that was a big consideration. Should I finally do this thing I've been wanting to do forever and go into the recording department, or should I just stick with my philosophy major and maybe go to law school? The reason I did what I did was because I even though I thought that could have been a feasible career path for me, it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be competitive. I'm not going to be competitive at something I don't want to do. I notoriously have a bad memory. I've always had a bad memory. And at the time, the computers weren't much of a thing. And so you still had to memorize everything, chapter and verse. If you wanted to be an attorney, that was a big part of it. Brute force memorization. And I just thought, not only am I not going to be able to compete because I don't want to do it, but I just can't remember stuff. Of course, by the time I would have gone through school and gotten out, there would have been computers. But I didn't know that at the time. And I don't think anybody else really did. And I don't regret it. It's just that was a path that was open. And, I considered walking down it. But I think anything to do with writing, and it's not necessarily a novelist or anything. It could have been manuals that I was writing. Technical writing, could have been any kind of writing. But an architect, absolutely. And probably the most compelling, the closest to heart, would be a psychologist.
From another profession now, we move oddly to cuisine. What would you cite as your favorite food?
Artichoke. Very simple. Artichoke.
From a favorite food now, we ask all guests to pick their favorite cultural icon. This could be a pioneer, maybe somebody in music, a religious leader, maybe a political figure, somebody who's changed history or the course of history in a certain way. Who would you pick as your favorite cultural icon?
Yeah, that's tough because there are so many that speak to different things. Clearly, Hendrix is a cultural icon, and he also created work that falls into the kind of wheelhouse of moving the electric guitar ahead. And I feel in some ways that if I'm not exactly standing on his shoulders, that I at least got a boost by his work even existing. So that might have to be the biggest contender. But I could also say Marilyn Monroe, Harry Houdini, Salvatore Dali, Leonardo da Vinci, Gandhi, Michelangelo. There's so many.
Yeah, lots of interesting choices you've mentioned.
Alan Watts, another
We go
one.
from a cultural icon now to a favorite place or holiday destination. When you get time to relax, go away with your wife or take a break, what would you say is your favorite place or holiday resort or destination?
Well, I think my favorite sort of tourist destination is a place I've only been once on my honeymoon, which is Venice. So, but to think of a place to be as apart from a vacation, Electric Lady Studios. I had the privilege of being in those studio walls for a bit while my wife was recording her album with her group, Les Zeppelin, back a few years ago, and Eddie Kramer, who basically built the studio for him, or at least it was his idea that he should have it, and helped decide how to put that together, engineered and produced that album. So I got to see him work in there, and just being there is very, very special.
You've mentioned several times your admiration for Jimi Hendrix and how he revolutionized the electric guitar in the 1960s. And he was also an incredible showman. And you also mentioned Les Paul, which was nice to hear because, of course, he again revolutionized the electric guitar and pickups, and an incredible guitar player as well, and did some incredible recordings with Mary Ford. But who would you cite, Thomas, as your favorite music artist? And what would you say is your all-time favorite album?
Yeah, well, I'll have to take a really broad view of that question. And of course, it's like saying, which is your favorite leg? Can we do without the other one? But I think if I had to pick a favorite musical artist, period, it would have to be J.S. Bach.
And what about albums? Is there an album that you go back to for a particular reason, or has a special place or time in your life? Is there one that you maybe listen to and dig out and it brings back fond memories?
Well, there's an album that really sticks out. Right now, like everybody, I go through phases. Right now, I'm listening a lot to an album by Piotr Antoszewski, who's a Polish pianist who put out a series of recordings of pieces from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier Number 2, but he didn't do them in order. He did them as though they were concert pieces, and he played them as though they were character pieces, and it's just absolutely stunning. But I think, if I had to pick an album that I thought was a kind of desert island album, I think it would have to be Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Because there's absolutely nothing about that album that's mediocre. And well, maybe I should take that back. It has a sort of nature to it that is unsurpassable. There's really nothing about it that doesn't stand the test of time remarkably well. It's kind of a timeless album, and it came out of a very experimental tradition, where, say, a few albums prior, Pink Floyd's Adam Hart Mother, no one's ever heard of that. It's very strange, very avant-garde, and this came out of that, and it managed to strike cultural and musical veins that really resonate to this day. It just passed being 50 years old, and I hear it's still on the Billboard charts. I mean, it's just shocking how someone could make a pop statement that profound.
And now we come on to the final two questions. Firstly, Thomas, what would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
Oh, I don't know. Probably, there are a few that I could think of off the top of my head that are, really incredible achievements, like getting a doctorate. I mean, most people who start don't finish, and ask anybody who did. It's grueling, and you get hazed at the end. There's just nothing about that that's negotiable. I could say that my EP is a particularly proud moment because it really is a culmination of all the things I learned before, having moved them ahead and rethought everything from the ground up. So that's really kind of me putting a stake in the musical multiverse and saying, this is my thing. So that's a big moment. That's something to be proud of. Even if the suite itself is something I wish to surpass sonically and musically, it's a big moment. It's a big watershed to have done that. But I think my proudest thing, or the thing that matters the most, is the work that I've just put into maintaining a good relationship with Lisa. That's the thing that that effort is the thing that has the biggest return.
And finally, Thomas, we wrap the interview with this final question. Thomas Millioto, how do you wish to be remembered?
Well, just basically as someone who participated decently in life with depth and kindness. Also as someone who helped raise spiritual well-being in people by making a significant contribution to the evolution of the classical guitar and its repertoire.
Thomas,
Yeah.
Thank you kindly for those final wise words. Thank you for joining me this evening for this edition of Your Take and sharing your journey from your beginnings, childhood, your upbringing in New York, discovery of music, learning the guitar and becoming obsessed, shall I say, with the electrical and classical guitar. And we've spoken about so many aspects of your life, your career, and your passion for music, which has come across within the last 60 minutes. So thank you kindly.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your show.
Where do we find out more about you and your work and your teachings? And maybe, of course, listening to your playing as well.
Well, my website, thomasmillioto.com, is a good place to go. And there is the Facebook page, my professional Facebook page, Thomas Millioto DMA, as in Doctor of Musical Arts. I'm also on Instagram, and there will be other social media coming out as well, which can be referenced from my site or any of the other social media I mentioned. So those are all good places to find me.
Wishing you well with all your future musical projects or any endeavors away from music that are creative. And thank you, a final word again, for being a guest and sharing your story.
And thank you, James. Thank you so much.